The Chippendale Mirror by E.F.Benson and read by Christopher Halton. No crime perhaps of recent years aroused more interest or stimulated to so high a degree the acumen of the amateur detective as that known as the Wimbledon mystery, whereby Mrs. Yates met the death that so long went unavenged. For nearly 6 months, it may be remembered, the police, even with the aid of the suggestions so liberally supplied them by their unprofessional colleagues, failed to lay hands on the murderer, who certainly exhibited the most consummate control of himself, and did not, as is generally the case, commit any of those acts of carelessness, born of regained confidence, whereby crime is commonly brought home to the criminal. Whether he would have escaped altogether indeed is doubtful, for though he had not, when the guilt was fastened upon him, incurred danger by reaping the fruits of his crime, he had not made up his mind to part with the evidence of it. His detection, however, was due to no blunder of his own, but to circumstances against which he could not possibly have guarded himself. It will be well to recall in outline the main facts of his crime. Mrs. Yates had lived for a number of years with her husband in one of the pleasant detached residences that face Wimbledon Common. The marriage, chiefly owing to her intemperate habits, had long been an unhappy one, and a week or so before her death, husband and wife had determined to live apart. She was Italian by birth, and proposed to go back again to her southern skies, and with the very handsome allowance that he was prepared to give her, to make her home there. The day before she left, he had supplied her with money to the extent of £150 as travelling expenses for herself and her maid, and to enable her to have control of ready cash until she had established her banking account in Rome. This sum was now in her possession, chiefly in the form of £5 notes with a certain amount of English gold. That afternoon her husband was summoned to London on some urgent business affairs, and in the evening telephoned to her that since he would be detained over them till after midnight, he would sleep in town and meet her next morning at Victoria Station. She would drive up there in the motor car which had taken him to town that afternoon, and would now return without him. Next morning at 7 o'clock her maid went into her room to call her, and found her lying on the floor by the bed with her throat cut. Her head was smothered in one of her pillows, which was tied round it, and the bed and the floor and the furniture of the room were thickly dabbed with her blood. The murderer, it seemed, had worn gloves, for no fingerprints were found, and indeed the charred remains of a pair belonging to her husband were discovered among the ashes in the grate. The fact that they were burnt seemed to indicate that the crime had taken place early in the night, for otherwise the fire in her room would have gone out. The motive for it was clear enough, for her money was missing. Servants sleeping in the house had not heard anything. For nearly 6 months no clues of any kind were obtained. It was ascertained beyond doubt that her husband was not implicated, for he was occupied at his office till after midnight, and shortly before 1 o'clock the night porter of the hotel where he stayed let him in and took him up in the lift to his room, while for the rest of the night no one entered or left the hotel. The strictest interrogatories were held of the servants in the house, and search made for the missing money, but no light of any sort was cast on this black and baffling crime. It seems certain, however, that the murder was committed by someone who had entered the house for that purpose, for the flower beds below the drawing-room windows, which were open, were marked with footprints which appeared to have been erased by the murderer, for they were blurred and without value as a clue. Among the banknotes there were certain new ones, of which the numbers were known, but no attempt was made to cash these. The 4 men-servants, butler, chauffeur, and 2 footmen, were narrowly watched, but none showed signs of being in unexplained affluence. The murderer had gone out again into the night as silent and as unobserved as he had entered. Mr. Yates finally never lived in the house again. The lease was put up for auction, and a certain part of the furniture, that of his wife's bedroom, was sold, for he could not bear to look on the things that had beheld so grim a tragedy. It was some 5 months after these events that I went in, on my way back from dinner, to see my friend Hugh Granger, who had not long ago settled in town. A sudden inheritance had come to him, and he had lashed out into a new and wonderful motor, a gem of a chauffeur, a fur coat, and a house in Bedford Square, at present rather sparsely furnished, for he had moved into it from narrower quarters. With a wisdom that refused to be hurried, he did not instantly fill up his ungarnished spaces with random purchases, but by dint of keeping his eyes and pockets well open, was gradually acquiring pieces that admirably suited the tall Adam-decorated rooms, and now a sideboard, now a root chair, now a Sheraton cabinet would contribute to the embellishment. Tonight I found him in a state of high content over a Chippendale mirror, which he had found in some incredible place in Putney, and had purchased for an incredibly low price. It had only just arrived, and at present stood on the floor of a sitting-room, till fixed in the divinely appointed place over the chimney-piece. Certainly it was a charming acquisition, and gloatingly he pointed out to me the fineness of its inlay, the graceful curves of its framework, its original gilding, and in particular its original glass. And the price too, he said. Why, a modern copy would cost more. Putney! I didn't know such a good thing could come out of Putney. A faint but imperious mewing was heard at the door, and Hugh hastened to obey the orders of Cyrus the Great, his Persian cat, who came very slowly into the room in order to give the maximum amount of trouble to the person holding the door open for his impressive entry. He took no notice, of course, either of the man ironically known as his master or of myself, and was just preparing to spring on his usual chair when he turned quickly and ran tail erect towards the mirror. Something about it pleased him enormously. The mirror might have been cold grouse, and with loud purrings he proceeded to patrol in front of it, rubbing himself against it. He trod high and delicately, protruding and sheathing his claws at each step, with flashing eyes and switching tail. He went round behind it, positively roaring in his throat with satisfaction, and finally sat down close in front of it, his nose almost touching the glass, and looking rapturously into it. But he was not, as you may sometimes see a cat do, regarding his own reflected image. His eyes travelled over the whole surface of it, with quick turnings of his head. "Cyrus is as pleased as you," I remarked. Hugh did not answer. He was watching the cat curiously. If there is one subject that interests him more than beautiful things, it is queer things. Things connected with the invisible psychical world which exists round us as surely as the material world, and of which we occasionally catch glimpses. Together we have had numerous strange experiences in séances and haunted houses, and it just occurred to me to wonder whether Cyrus's behaviour was being of psychical interest to him. For myself, as far as I am aware, at that moment this rapturous preoccupation of the cat with the mirror gave me no further sentiment than interest in the mysterious perceptions of animals. "I would give the mirror itself to know what Cyrus sees in it," said Hugh at length. "I know—" He stopped suddenly and pointed at the reflecting surface. "What is that?" he said. "There is something happening in the mirror." At that moment, it may have been merely the suggestion on his part, I felt that sensation which is so well known to those who have experienced psychical phenomena. It is exactly as if some summons had come to you, not from outside at all, but from inside the brain, which commands your attention. Simultaneously with that mysterious signal, I felt a sudden movement of air stir in the room, a faint but quite perceptible cold current. At the same moment Cyrus, who had been sitting quite still, got up in a sort of ecstasy of content, and looking fixedly into the mirror, clawed at the carpet. I followed Hugh's pointing finger and looked too. The surface of the glass, in spite of the bright light in which it stood, had grown dark, so that I no longer saw the reflection of the cat, of Hugh standing behind him, of the candles that burnt on the table near it. It was dim and dusk in the mirror, and in the dimness something, I could not see what, moved across it. Immediately afterwards I saw the normal reflections resume themselves, and Cyrus, suddenly losing interest in it, turned away and marched across the carpet to his usual chair. Hugh spoke. "It's gone," he said, "but I thought— No, tell me if you thought anything." I own to having been considerably startled. This sudden vanishing of the reflections, above all the sense that there had been something below that darkness, was peculiarly uncomfortable. "It went dark," I said, "and something moved in the darkness." He laughed. "It's a cheaper bargain than I imagined," he said. "I saw exactly the same thing. I suppose the Psychical Society would call it a case of collective hallucination, but that doesn't seem to explain much." "Let's call it the haunted mirror then," said I, "though perhaps that explains even less." "But one knows what it means," said he. It was some 2 days afterwards that I was in the house again. In the interval the mirror had been put in its appointed place, and looked admirable there, but it had not shown any further signs of behaving in the way mirrors are not expected to behave, and losing its reflecting powers. Here, now it was more on a level with my eyes, I could examine it easily and admire the excellence of the work. The glass, as I have said, was original, and, as is usually the case with such things, there were a quantity of dark spots on it where the glaze of mercury behind it had crumbled and fallen off. But in this more detailed examination I saw that certain of these spots were not under the glass, but on it. There were not more than some half-dozen of them, but at the lower edge of the glass, where it was set into its wooden frame, there was in the crack a little brown deposit similar to the minute specks on the glass itself, as if some liquid had run into it and dried there rustily, forming just such a stain as you will get below a nail driven into the wall of a fruit garden. But I noticed this so incuriously that when Hugh joined me, I did not even speak of it. He was inclined to be querulous about the normal behaviour of the mirror. "I looked at it half the morning," he said, "and could see nothing but my own face, and I held Cyrus up to it to his great disgust. He didn't take the smallest interest in it and merely wriggled. But did you ever see a mirror so clearly made for that particular place?" "But no more hallucinations?" I asked. "Not one, not the ghost of one, I may say. All the same, Cyrus saw something the other night, and he enjoyed it immensely. Cats have tremendous perceptions, I believe, and they love horrors. They love the dead, you know. By the way, I want you to dine here tomorrow night. 2 marvellously tiresome cousins have asked themselves, and as I always help you out on similar occasions, I expect reciprocal advantages. Free trade, isn't it?" The marvellously tiresome cousins lived up to their character, and we spent a dismal evening. They did not play cards. The lady objected to the smell of cigarettes. They neither of them appeared to possess any ideas on any subject, and, worst of all, they would not go away. Already it was close on midnight. Hugh, with eyes of despair, was talking the most dreary nonsense on the subject of foreign politics, when suddenly there came to my brain that secret signal I have spoken of, and a little cold draught crept round my head. At that moment Cyrus, who had been sleeping peacefully in his red chair, awoke in a state of purring excitement. He stretched and waved his tail, and then, suddenly catching sight of the mirror, made one superb bound and landed on the chimney-piece. Hugh's voice ceased from its stream of foreign politics, and he took 2 steps across to the fireplace and looked in the mirror. "What a beautiful cat," said the lady, who did not like the smell of tobacco. "And how beautifully it jumps! How lucky there was nothing on the chimney-piece for it to break! Poor pussy!" I had stood up too, and a voice came to me as in a dream. for all that was real was comprised in the bright glass, which had again grown suddenly dark. I leant over Hugh's shoulder, hearing his breath coming quick and short as he looked, and in the darkness that hung on the wall of the bright room, I saw certain things. I was looking into a dark room that was lit only by a faint gleam that came through a window blind opposite, and by a lantern that was being carried across that room. A bed glimmered whitely there, and in the bed was a figure that suddenly sat upright as the moving lantern came close to it. The lantern was carried by a man, and for 1 second I caught a glimpse of his face. How long this vision lasted in the actual world of time and space I cannot say. It seemed to last for just as long as it would take a man to cross a room. And then I became aware that Hugh and I were looking into a perfectly normal mirror, and that Cyrus jumped down on the hearthrug with a soft thud. But in that minute I had descended into some horror of great darkness. I was entangled in a terror that was only bearable because it was mingled with the intensest curiosity. I knew that what I had seen, that which had dimmed the polished surface of the glass for those few seconds, was something hellish and awful intruding into the quiet boredom of this room in a solid house in a commonplace square. Some silent witness of a tragedy had come to trouble the house. It was not just a photograph of some mysterious fiendish deed that had been presented. It was the very deed itself. And as yet I knew not nor guessed what the deed was. Simply at some time or another a man with lean, clean-shaven face, which somehow I thought I had seen in actual life, had come with a lantern into a bedroom. But I did not doubt that it was of something terrible that I had had a glimpse. All this flashed through my consciousness as I turned back into the room again. The two guests were already on their feet, preparing at last to go. Cyrus was curled up in his chair, and Hugh was saying in a rather odd voice, "What already? Surely it is very early." We confabulated together when he returned from his work of speeding the departing, with occasional glances at the mirror till late into the early hours. We had seen, it appeared, very much the same thing, but whereas I had noticed the face of the man who carried the lantern, he had seen that of the woman who had sat up in bed. To me that part of the room had been blurred. I had not seen whether it was woman or man who lay there. To him also the lantern light had gleamed on something the man carried. It was then that I remembered the brown deposit in the crack between the mirror and its frame. Now this vision had appeared on 2 occasions about midnight, and our theory, fantastic and terrible, began to take shape. Had some tragedy, such as we had seen the opening of, taken place somewhere at that hour? Had the mirror retained, as on a photographic plate, some image which was ready, if the conditions for its psychical transmission were favourable, to be reproduced again, made visible to mortal eye? By strange coincidence the mirror had come into my friend's possession, and he and I, both sensitive to psychical phenomena, had seen a fragment of the deed that had been enacted in front of it. It seemed, too, as if the power that made this visible was on the increase. The message was getting through more clearly. On the first occasion we had seen little more than darkness. On the second we had seen something of that which took place below it. We had agreed to meet again the next night, and I arrived at the house about 11, only to find a note from Hugh that he had been unavoidably called away, but expected to be back before midnight. "Look at the woman's face," he had underlined. "An idea has occurred to me." It was with a certain faltering of courage that I settled to go upstairs and wait for him. As I went up, a great flounce of movement from behind the curtain on the stairs startled me, and Cyrus pounced out, preceding me to the room where the mirror hung. He ran in eagerly when I opened the door, and turning on the electric light, I found him erect and superb and pleased in the centre of the carpet. For some while I occupied myself with the evening papers which contained news of merit. Cyrus was coiled up on his chair, footsteps, which had sounded muffled as they passed up the back staircase, grew quiet, and the hush of night settled down on the house. Outside, where the air was foggy, the square was noiseless, save for an occasional hoot of a motor passing into the streets. By degrees I found the light growing rather dim, as if the fog had penetrated into the room, and soon it became impossible to read the paper. Yet the air seemed clear enough, and the mirror above the chimney-piece sharply reflected, from where I sat, the ceiling and cornice of the room on which the light from the hearth played and flickered. I had no watch with me, and thus no accurate idea of the speed with which time passed, but I was conscious of an increasing anxiety that Hugh should return. Then, quite suddenly, Cyrus awoke and stood up on his chair with eyes flashing and eager. With one bound he perched himself on the chimney-piece, and following his movement, I saw that the brightness of the reflections in the mirror was growing dim and blurred. Simultaneously came the strong inward call to attend, and I felt my hair just raised by a draught of cold breeze that came from nowhere. It, whatever it was coming. At that, sheer unreasoning terror seized me. It had been bad enough the night before when Hugh was here, and when his two guests gave the comforting sense of companionship. Now, when it had caught me alone, the terror was 10 times magnified. Yet in spite of it, I did not, simply because I could not merely leave the room. The flesh and blood of me cried out to go, but some force, as overmastering as brute physical compulsion, made me get up and walk across the room to where the mirror hung, already a black oblong on the wall. It was dark in the mirror, but very soon I saw that it was dark, because I was actually standing in the dim room which it disclosed. A little light came filtering through the blind of the window opposite me, and in the dimness I began to see the objects that the room contained. Everything appeared life-size, as if I was actually standing there. Opposite, then, was the window through which this little light came. On the left of it was a dressing table where silver faintly gleamed, and also I could just see a glass and a decanter. To the left of that was another window over which curtains were drawn. On the left-hand wall a bed projected into the room, and on the pillow was a woman's head. I appeared to stand close to the foot of this bed. On the right-hand wall beside the window was a closed door, and near it a fireplace. Over the fireplace hung a mirror, and I saw that in form and curve and size it was the mirror into which I was now looking. Suddenly this door opened, and a man carrying a lantern came in. He flashed it quickly round the room, and then came across towards the bed where the woman lay. She sprang up to a sitting position, and the light fell on her face, so that for 1 second I saw it quite clearly. Next moment he had seized her pillow and bent it round her head, appearing to tie it there, and wildly groping, she wrestled with him. He made one dreadful slicing movement with his hand across her throat, and I saw the blood stream onto her nightdress. She still clutched him, and across the room they struggled together while the blood flowed from her. Then, as the life ebbed, her struggles ceased, and presently she sank in a heap on the floor. But I had seen her face before it was smothered in the pillow, and I knew I had seen it, or its presentment before. Gradually the light came back into the mirror, and I found myself looking no longer at these horrors, but at my own white reflection. There was a soft thud on the ground beside me, and Cyrus had jumped down again. At that moment I heard a motor stop at the street door and went downstairs. Hugh had just let himself in, and behind him, carrying a rug, stood his chauffeur, and instantly I knew who was the man who had come into a bedroom one night and done to death the woman who slept there. A hunt through picture papers next day confirmed the identity of the woman, and after making certain arrangements, Hugh rang his bell that night at a little before 12, which was the summons for his chauffeur. He talked to him for some minutes while I watched the mirror, and when again it began to grow dark, I nodded to Hugh, who got up from his chair. "Look in that mirror, Atkinson," he said, and as he spoke the curtain behind me twitched. For myself, I merely watched Atkinson's face, and presently there passed over it a change so appalling that the mask of horror I looked on seemed scarcely human. A hideous pallor spread over the man's face, the sweat poured from him, his mouth opened and panted for breath, and his eyes, glued to the glass that showed him his own crime, seemed to bulge and protrude from his head. Then, with a yell that still sounds in my ears, he fell in a heap on the hearthrug, and from behind the curtain there stepped out the two men whom Scotland Yard had sent down. There remains but little to be told. In the wretched man's bedroom, hidden behind a chest of drawers, were found certain banknotes of which the numbers were known. Subsequently, I went down to Wimbledon, and there in the bedroom where Mrs. Yates's body was discovered in the morning by her maid was an oblong of unfaded paper above the chimney-piece commensurate with the shape of the Chippendale Mirror. The end.